dad was outside again counting birds, and Mama plugged in a nightlight, and I saw the queen of the world.
Welcome to the Golden Hour Birth Podcast. I am your co-host, Liz.
And I'm your co-host, Natalie. And tonight we have Carly on. She is going to share her birth story of her 4-year-old and then her 2-year-old as well. Carly, thanks so much for coming on tonight.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Liz and Natalie. It's awesome to be here. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Welcome.
So if you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about you and your family, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I'm a mom to 2 little girls. It is the best job I've ever had and the most challenging job I've ever had. And I was a teacher for a year of 3rd graders. And I've also taught preschool. So just to give you an idea, I'm sure you two get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's full.
It's crazy.
Thanksgiving's coming up, and my husband says to my almost 4-year-old who just started preschool, he's like, yeah, we both have off, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We get a 4-day weekend. And I was like, Mom doesn't get any days off. And he was like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, are you kidding me? So yeah, it's awesome, but it's really challenging. I was a teacher for a little while. And then after I had my first daughter, I decided to stay home with her. Part of that was that I had a lot of anxiety about leaving her and going back to work. And part of it was that I, really just wanted to be home with her. My husband is also a teacher. He teaches 7th grade. So he's got lots of great stories that he comes home with. We live just outside of Philadelphia. I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia. And 2 years ago, we moved just outside the city. So we're in like one of the suburbs in the surrounding area. And it's quiet. It's very family friendly. And we love it here. So pretty much it.
Awesome. So if you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about when you and your husband decided to start a family and then what pregnancy was like.
Sure. So first daughter was kind of unexpected. It wasn't like we had ever decided to start a family. I was in the middle of graduate school. I was in the middle of student teaching. And I was about 8 weeks pregnant when I found out that I was pregnant with her. I just thought I had like a late case of the flu. It was like April. And I was like, I've been just like dizzy for a week. I feel nauseous. And I have a history of depression. And I was like coming home every day from school and falling asleep on the couch. And he was like, what's going on with you? Are you depressed again? Like, is this something I should be worried about? And I was like, no, I think I'm just like coming down with the flu. And when like nothing changed, I didn't get better. I didn't get worse. I was kind of like, I took a pregnancy test, came back positive. I had a, fairly easy pregnancy, aside from the stress of, finishing graduate school and finding a job, starting a new job, teaching while pregnant. Like that was pretty stressful, trying to tell my principal that I'm pregnant. And I actually got a job teaching at the school where I did my student teaching. So I knew all the teachers there. I knew a lot of the students there. I knew the principal. I saw an OBGYN throughout my whole pregnancy. And I always felt like there was a little bit of something missing. Like I would ask them questions and I would kind of just be like brushed off. And it was like, whatever. There was never really any talk of like how I was managing my depression. There was never any talk of like nutritionally, how was I taking care of myself. And so I always just felt like there was like a little bit of something lacking, but it's normal. I had always seen an OBGYN. My appointments were always like 10 minutes long. So I went into labor with my daughter. Actually, it started at school. My water broke in the middle of the day. And I wasn't sure if it was like, if it had actually broken or if it was just kind of like leaking or if it was just like extra discharge so I had like put on a pad and I finished out the day. I wasn't having any kind of contractions. It was like a Friday afternoon. I stayed late to put some stuff together because I was like, I think I might not be coming back on Monday, Let me just put some stuff together for my sub. And when I left, one of my grade partners, who was also my host teacher when I was student teaching, was like, are you feeling okay? Like, you've been moving kind of slow today. I'm not really sure I'm going to see you on Monday. And I was like, no, I'm fine. Like, I'll see you Monday. And by the time I got home at like 5 or 6 o'clock, like the contractions had just started and they were coming very consistently every 3 minutes. I came home, I took a shower, I called my husband. He was on the way home from work. And I was like, I think maybe we need to go to the hospital. I called the hospital and they were like, yeah, take your time, come on in. So I finished packing my bag. We get in the car, we go. We stopped for a sandwich on the way. He hadn't eaten dinner. And I called my mom. She was going to come to be like my extra support person. So this is where like my first birth story gets like a little crazy. So we showed up to the hospital in the middle of a shift change, and it was like nobody knew what to do with me. And they put me out in the waiting room in a wheelchair for about 40 minutes. And no one ever really came to check on me or to get me.
God.
My husband had to go and tell them like, yo, my wife is still out here. Is somebody going to come get her? Finally, they did. They brought me back into triage, and it was like, it just felt like I had no say in stuff. It was like, all right, take your clothes off, put this on, lay down on the bed, strap this on. No, you're not allowed to move. No, okay. When do you want your epidural? And I was like, well, I'm not really sure. I want an epidural. Like, I took a birth class. It's kind of like, well, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. But it's not like, I kind of expected, I guess my expectations of what birth was going to be like weren't accurate. And I feel like that's pretty common. So it was kind of like, I expected, the nurses to be like, oh, well, you don't want an epidural. Okay, let's talk about what options you do have for pain management. Where it was kind of like, well, what do you mean you don't want an epidural? Everybody gets an epidural. Like, you don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
So I got an epidural, and I guess I was about 6 centimeters. And then, my labor had kind of slowed after that. And I fully dilated eventually, and I pushed for 3 hours. And actually, this is really interesting. I had an ultrasound when I got to the hospital, and you could see my daughter's eye sockets. So she was posterior. She was face up. My husband was like, I can see her eye sockets. But it didn't really register to me that, I didn't know posterior was even a thing.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like later on when I was pushing and she was stuck and I couldn't get her out. No one was ever like, hey, she was posterior when she came in. Maybe we need to like move you into different positions. It was just kind of like, oh, well, the anesthesiologist who gave me my epidural was, am I allowed to curse on your show?
Yeah.
Okay. He was an asshole, a total asshole. He never introduced himself, like came in the room like he was God's gift to, women in labor, and yelled at me because I wasn't sitting properly, and then yelled at me to lay down after he inserted it. And then when I didn't, he like physically grabbed me from behind and pulled me back and threw me on the bed. And then like had yelled at me again, like, I told you needed to lay down. And I just like, I just was like, yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And it was like nobody, like my nurse didn't like blink an eye. It wasn't like, oh my God. It's so like, it's normal. Like that's like normal behavior to me. And I was kind of like feeling at this point that things were like really out of control. This is not what I wanted. This is not what I expected. I really wanted like a calm, peaceful birth for my daughter. And it was just like, nobody cared. Nobody really cared for me, like assembly line, in and out of the hospital, whatever. So eventually I had like fully dilated and pushed. The doctor, who I had never met before, came in and was like, hey, I'm your doctor. I'm going to deliver your baby. And after 3 hours of pushing, she was like, yeah, let's talk about a C-section. So we tried a vacuum. It didn't work. And there were like some other little things along the way that I was kind of like, wait, what is this? What's going on? Nobody's really telling me what's going on. I finally consented to a C-section, even though like I was still tolerating labor. My baby was still tolerating labor. It was kind of like, well, your time's up, let's. So the C-section was like pretty terrifying. They strapped down your arms. I got sick a couple times. It was like, nobody told me what was going on. Nobody was like, hey, this is what we're doing now. It was just like, whatever. And then it's done. And then I heard her cry. And it was kind of like, after that, everything was, okay. I didn't really recognize it at the time as like trauma. It took me a while afterwards to finally realize that I was, having some sort of trauma left over from her birth. But I just had a lot of negative feelings afterwards. It was like, I was disappointed. I was upset. I felt like my body had failed me. I felt like I had failed my daughter. It was not a good experience. I didn't want to go back to the hospital. I didn't want to have the same experience ever again. So after she was born, I was like, because I have a history of depression, I was expecting postpartum depression. And I got hit with a lot of anxiety, which I have never really had in my life. And I know, Liz, like you had talked about having postpartum anxiety. And for me, like, I don't know, it was never like officially diagnosed as postpartum anxiety, but at like 6 months postpartum with her, I got flagged at her pediatrician's office because I had like scored pretty high on some of the anxiety questions. But it was just like, I didn't want to leave her. I had a lot of anxiety about leaving her. I couldn't leave her with anybody. I didn't want anybody to hold her. If like I gave her to somebody, like not even my husband, if I gave her to somebody, it was like, I felt like I was like drowning until I had her back. And I guess that was probably like probably part of like the trauma response of,
Yeah.
giving birth. But I made a change for my second daughter. So I got pregnant with my second daughter when my first daughter was 15 months. She was 15 months old. And it was like 2 weeks into our quarantine for COVID, I found out I was pregnant. And I knew I wanted to do something different. I didn't want another C-section. I knew that already. And I had already like Googled whether or not I could have a vaginal birth after a C-section. And one of my husband's cousins actually had a vaginal birth, I guess, the previous year after she had a C-section. So I knew it could be done. I knew I could talk to somebody about it. So I had some time over quarantine to like do some research. I found some good podcasts to listen to. I started like doing some research into like the natural process of labor. I took an online birthing class instead of one affiliated with my hospital. And I was like feeling really good about it. And then at my anatomy scan, they told me that she had a lemon sign, which is when the baby's head is shaped like a lemon. And it's a characteristic of spina-bifida. So that kind of like was like, whoa, like threw a wrench in everything that I had planned. But also it was COVID. So I was going to all my appointments alone. I was going to all my ultrasounds alone. So they sent me to a level 2 ultrasound at maternal fetal medicine. And I went by myself. My parents watched my older daughter, and my husband dropped me off at the door and then parked in the parking garage and waited there until I came back out. And that was like really upsetting. Like I had made peace with whatever was going to happen at that point, but it was kind of like I was in there with other women who were also in there alone. And it was like really upsetting. Like, hey, we're all here together, but we're all alone. Like you're not allowed to have your support person. You're not allowed to have your partner there. So that was crazy. She ended up being okay. And then I made the decision after that I was like really going to fight for my VBAC. So I had joined my local ICANN Facebook group, which is the International Cesarean Awareness Network. So it was like the greater Philadelphia area. And I had talked to some women about my provider and the hospital that I had delivered at. And they were like, listen, it's very not VBAC supportive. Like make a change your provider, change the hospital if you can. Here are some recommendations. So I went to my 24-week appointment and I had like a list of questions I was going to ask my doctor. And she like red flagged on all of them. And they had told me in my Facebook group, like, hey, they'll probably pull on you what's called a bait and switch. So they'll tell you they're really supportive, but then they put all these conditions on whether or not you can VBAC. And then at the very end, they'll be like, hey, well, you're 38 weeks. Let's schedule you a C-section. Like if your body if you don't go into labor by 39 weeks, you'll have a repeat C-section. Like for no reason other than, I've already had one C-section. But also along this way, I have had done some research on posterior babies and had, found like laboring positions that are more conducive for birthing a posterior baby, and was having a lot of feelings of anger and resentment that like my C-section was probably unnecessary for the simple fact that like maybe I could have gotten her out if I wasn't laying flat on my back with an epidural. So I decided at 28 weeks to make the switch to a midwife. I decided I wanted to go natural. So I did some hypnobirthing classes. I was doing like spinning babies and walking, a couple of days a week, lots of exercise. I was like really focused on my nutrition, and I sat on a birthing ball all the time. I was like refused. I didn't want to have another posterior baby. I was like, I'm not doing this. Like I slept on my left side. I sat on a birthing ball when I was watching TV or eating dinner, or I would sit on the floor or, instead of like reclined in a chair. And my husband during this time was like, he wasn't initially supportive of me switching to a midwife. So we had lots of conversations about that and the benefits of that. We had talked to a former coworker of his who had 2 home births at the time, and like how she had decided to do that was that her husband had cancer and she felt like he never really got individualized care. And she was like, I want that for when I give birth.
Wow.
So that
was your hospital allowing partners in delivery room at that time?
So they were, they were allowing one support person. They weren't allowing doulas. And it was like you had one support person for the whole time you were there. And once you were checked in, you weren't allowed to leave. So my midwife had told me that when we go into the hospital, we bring everything in with us, including the baby's car seat. Because once we're in there, we're not allowed back out. And if you go back out, you're not allowed back in. And you can't leave the hospital, without the baby in a car seat. It was like crazy time. But I feel so bad for all the women who had to give birth like during quarantine without partners, without.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they had told us, we had to bring everything in, couldn't leave after that. So we were prepared for that.
Was the midwife going to deliver at the hospital?
At the hospital.
Or
So
doing a home birth?
No, the midwife I saw does home births, but I don't know if they were certified to do VBAC home births.
Okay.
But they had hospital privileges at a hospital that was about 40 minutes away from our house.
So not the one you originally delivered at?
No, I switched hospitals too. Yeah,
Okay.
like, I'm not going back there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he wasn't initially on board, and I had finally convinced him, and we made the switch. Yeah, and I never actually got to tour the hospital because they weren't doing that, during COVID. So it was kind of like I looked at pictures online, and I was like, yeah, it looks pretty nice. Lots of big windows, and it's across from, like a nature preserve. So I was like, oh, that'll be nice to give birth with like, trees and flowers, and maybe the sun rising up over, with the windows open in the morning and.
I love
that
it.
kind of stuff. Yeah. So I had picked out, like, my midwife was like, why don't you get yourself some of those like twinkling fairy lights, to hang in the room, and maybe bring like some candles or some of those like tea, like the electric tea lights or whatever. And I was like, oh yeah, that sounds really nice. Or, if you want to bring like essential oils. And I was like planning out, this birth that I was going to have that I guess I hadn't like never really thought about the first time around.
Yeah.
But I would go to see my midwife, and I would be like, listen, I don't want to, my baby's in the same position that my first baby was. Like, her butt is on the right side. I know that like her hands are more like on the left side. I'm really afraid that when I go into labor, she's going to rotate into a posterior position and get stuck there. And she's like, my midwife was like, well, no, I wouldn't really worry about it. Like babies can rotate out of the posterior position. And I had this like feeling, I was like, no, this one will probably get stuck in posterior again. So my husband was like terrified of if I had to have another C-section, what that would do to me mentally, because he knew like mentally the first time around was not a good experience. And I was like fighting so hard to get this, that if I did end up having to have a repeat C-section, he was like really afraid. And he wanted to have these discussions about like, well, what if you do? And I was like, no, I'm not. Like, that's not even an option for me. And he was like, this is what I'm really afraid of. Like, if something happens and you do, like what you're going to be like mentally after that. And I was like, mentally, I can't even like put that thought in my head, because I don't want that kind of negativity surrounding that. Once I start thinking C-section, then it's going to be like, then I'm going to doubt my body's ability to do what I know it can. And that was like another thing. My OBGYN was kind of like, well, I don't know if you'll be able to like get your baby out. Whereas my midwife was like, never once doubted, that my body could do it. And it was like, well, we'll go to 42 weeks if you're not in labor by then. Well, we'll talk induction first. There was never talk of a repeat C-section. It was like, you can do this. I'm fully confident that you're able to, and I will support you however you need. Like, I had 45-minute appointments with my midwife where we talked about my fears, where we talked about my concerns, any questions I had. Like, just the level of care was just so different. And I really felt cared for, which was awesome. Like, Liz, I know you had birth with midwives. Natalie, I'm sorry, I don't really know your story, but I did. Liz shared her birth story with me.
Yeah. We both did midwives.
Okay. Well, then, yeah, you get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's totally different. Yeah.
Totally.
I wish I had known that the first time around. Yeah. Did you both have doulas too?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah,
I was going to ask you about that. Did you?
No.
Okay. I mean, like, I know like they would have to be virtual, I guess, by that time, but I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. And I wish I'd known. I didn't know a doula was a thing the first time I gave, the first time I had my baby. Like, I didn't really learn about that until the second time around. And then it was kind of like, well, you can't really have a doula, and financially I wasn't sure if it was possible for us, I guess. But anyway, I went into labor with my second daughter. I had been having like some stop and start labor the week before I actually went into labor with her. At night it would start, and I'd have like a couple hours of contractions, and then they would stop. And this was kind of like an interesting thing. When I had my ultrasound, like when I conceived my second daughter, we were trying. I knew when I ovulated. I knew like when her due, like I could figure out her due date based on that. And they had tried to tell me at my OBGYN's office that they were going to base it off of my last menstrual period, which would have made my due date 3 days earlier, which doesn't seem like such a big deal. But if they're like, you can't go past 40 weeks, then it becomes a big deal. If I needed those 3 extra days for my body to do its thing, and you've cut my time short, then I don't get the chance to do that.
Yeah.
So, and that's exactly how it went. She came on her like real due date 3 days later, because for my first order, I think they had told me they usually base the due date off the first ultrasound, like the dating ultrasound, after you've, done your initial, like, this was my last period. Because for my first order, I had like ovulated late. I think I ovulated like a week later on like day 21 or something like that. So my original due date was off. But anyway, she came the night before her due date. I went into labor and my contractions were coming about every 3 minutes, I guess. And I texted my midwife at like 1:30 in the morning. And I was like, I'm having pretty regular contractions, just to let you know, I think this might be, and they were like, okay, we'll get in the bath or, try to sleep. Don't really pay attention to it. And then there was no follow up like, hey, let me know when they're like this far apart or, so we had talked about my best strategy was to labor at home as long as possible to avoid any unnecessary interventions in the hospital, which I was totally fine with. So it was close to Christmas time. I had gone to the living room and like put on the Christmas lights and was like hanging out there and just breathing and listening to, like my hypnobirthing tracks and music. And before I knew it, I had been in labor for probably about like 6 hours. It was like 5 o'clock in the morning. And my husband got up to go to the bathroom and he comes out and he's like, are you okay? And I was like, yeah, I'm good. And he was like, are you in labor? And I was like, yeah, I think I might be. And he was like, all right, I'm going to call, my sister was going to come watch my older daughter. He was like, all right, I'm going to call your sister, tell her to take her, tell her to start to get ready to come by. Let me email my principal. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go take a shower. And then, like we'll come back and get ready to head to the hospital. So he called my sister and he was like, yeah, maybe about like an hour. I think we're going to get ready to go. So this was December. And my sister had gone out, I guess, to start her car at some point. And, the windshield was frozen and a whole big thing. She couldn't get the car unfrozen. I get in the shower and my husband's on the porch, like emailing his principal or setting up lesson plans. I don't know. But I get in the shower and I'm like 2 minutes in the shower and I started feeling the urge to push.
Oh my God.
And I was like, oh no, like it's time to go. We got to go now. But the water just felt so good. It was like, I couldn't get out. So I finally managed to turn off the water. I climbed out of the tub and I'm laying on the bathroom floor and I'm calling to him and he's not responding. And I'm like, what are you doing? What are you doing out there? Like writing lesson plans from scratch? Come on, like we got to go. And I'm calling him and finally he hears me and I'm like, yo, we got to go. I'm pushing. And I made it to the bedroom. I got dressed real quick. I brushed my hair. I ran to the living room as my sister, I think he had called her back at some point and was like, you need to come now. As my sister was coming in the door and I was like sitting on the living room floor and he calls my midwife and he's like, yeah, we're not going to make it to the hospital. It was 40 minutes away and now it was about to be like rush hour traffic. So it was going to take us about at least an hour and a half to get there. He's like, we're not going to make it. And my midwife was like, all right, well, I can come to you. Do you want to go to a closer hospital? And he's like, I'm going to take her to the closest hospital, which was the hospital where I had my C-section. And I like did not want to go back there. And I was almost in tears telling him like, no, please, like take me anywhere else but there. I don't care if I have the baby in the car. Like, just don't take me back there. And he's like, no, we don't really have a choice. We got to go. So we made it out to the car. He must have drove like a maniac. I don't really remember, but we made it there really fast. And he dropped me off at the emergency room doors. And I didn't know this at the time, but they didn't let him in right away. Like he tried to get everything out of the car and walk through the doors. And they were like, oh, no, you're not allowed up till they call down for you. So they took me up and, they're trying to have me like fill out paperwork and have you given birth before? Like asked me all kinds of questions. I'm like, yes. Okay. Was it a vaginal birth or a C-section? I'm like, C-section. Okay. Well, we'll get you prepped for another C-section. And I was like, whoa, no. My baby's coming out.
Oh my gosh.
And I had the same conversation with probably about 5 or 6 different nurses who were like trying to to put me into another C-section when I'm actively pushing my baby out. And I was like, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong other than the fact that I've already had a C-section and you want me to have another one.
Wow.
They checked me and they were like, all right, you're complete and baby's at 0 station or wherever she was. I don't remember. And then they were like, all right, well, were you planning on having an epidural? And I was like, no. And then the doctor who had checked me was like kind of mean. She laughed at me and was like, all right, well, good, because you're too late. And then they took me to the delivery room. And I had at some point at home gotten up and put on a TENS machine. Like I had learned about using a TENS machine. And when I got to the hospital, they were like, what is this? What is this on your back? And then one of the older nurses was like, oh, I haven't seen these since the midwives use these. And I was like, yes. So yeah, they finally got me into a bed and they finally called my husband. I guess I gave them his number because I didn't have my phone. They called him, they let him up. And while I was pushing, one of my nurses just kept telling me like, well, if you can't get her out, I'm going to have to section you. I don't want to have to section you. And I was like really angry. Like, why are you even mentioning a C-section? Like I didn't want.
That's not encouraging at all.
No,
Like,
right. Not at all.
Like, is she trying to scare you? Like what?
Yeah,
I don't even know why. Yeah. What's the point of?
I don't know. Other than, I have no idea. But I finally pushed her out and she came out and was posterior, just like I knew she was going to be.
You called it.
I felt like totally vindicated that I had that I could do it, that I had pushed out, a posterior baby. And that was like so amazing to me that it didn't matter that I had, once again been mistreated by the hospital. I mean, it still mattered, but it was kind of like a big F you, like I did it. You were trying to talk me into a C-section up until the very last minute, and here she is. So
did your midwife make it in time?
No.
Oh,
they wouldn't have let her in anyway. They wouldn't have let her into the
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But they called at some point and, got all my information or whatever. But my midwife had texted me and was like, hey, did you have the VBAC? And I was like, I did. And she was like, yeah, you're a rock star, which was really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but it was totally nuts.
I don't know if I've heard about a TENS machine.
Oh, yeah. You don't know about them?
No.
I had come across them during like my research about like pain relief options. I forget what it stands for. It's like a transcuticle electro something. It sends like pulses. Like, I don't want to say like it's like electric pulses, but they use it, I think, for like if you have like sports injuries and things like that. So,
like a stem? Like a stem machine in a way?
Maybe. I don't know if I know what a stem machine is.
I've like had it on like my lower back.
That's like the same initials. So maybe
it might be.
Maybe. I don't know.
But it's like little sticky pads and then you push the button. Yeah. And it sends like pulses through. Yeah. It's supposed to help with.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Me and my husband have both done those for like lower back pain because we're, in our 90s. So when you said like TENS, I'm like, I don't think I've ever heard about that.
Yeah. Then it's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. That's awesome.
Yeah. It's awesome for labor pains. Yeah. Works
very
really
nice.
Well.
Yeah. I wish I knew that because I had a posterior baby too.
Oh, yeah. Did you have a lot of back labor?
Yes. Oh, that like sent me over the edge and I got an epidural for that.
Okay.
Because I was like, this is absolutely terrible.
Yeah. See, I didn't have back labor. So I didn't really know that either one of them were posterior. I didn't have any kind of back labor.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Maybe their heads were just lighter. I don't know.
Maybe had enough. But I did after like the day following or 2 days later, I had really bad tailbone. I think because like that was like the back of her head against my tailbone. I was like, why is my tailbone so sore? And now that's probably why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how was your recovery and postpartum with her?
That was crazy. We moved 10 days after I had her. We moved out of the city. We had tried to get it before, we tried to move before she came, but it just didn't work out that way. So we had made settlement in November and then weren't able to move until right after Christmas. And actually my recovery with her, I had a 2nd-degree tear, which it didn't fully heal by 6 weeks. When I went to see my midwife, she had to use that, like, I think it's like the silver nitrate or whatever it is to kind of like cauterize it. So I had like an additional 2 weeks of healing with that. But other than that, I mean, I felt pretty good. I didn't really have much anxiety with her. I felt like I managed postpartum really well with her, given the circumstances.
Yeah.
And then I feel like that extra 2 weeks really helped. Like once my husband and I went back to having sex, like my first daughter, I had a lot of pain afterwards. And even though I didn't actually have a vaginal birth, I still had a lot of pain. And I assume that was related to probably like scar tissue from my C-section. But
yeah,
I felt like after my second daughter, I had no pain the first time we had sex. And it was like better, I feel like, than it had been for a long time. So
yeah.
You
almost like didn't have a vaginal birth though. You pushed for 3 hours and then had a C-section. I'm just like, that would create like so much swelling and everything else down there.
And I've heard stories of women who have like had episiotomies and then still had to have a C-section. So now you're like really healing from both. I was like, thank God I didn't have to have, thank God that didn't happen. But
yeah. Wow. I guess just like with your anxiety and everything, like, did you talk to anybody? How were you managing it?
Yeah, I saw a therapist at the pediatrician's office. I saw her for a couple of weeks, I guess when my daughter was about 6 or 7 months old. And I don't know. I feel like I've never really found a therapist I've connected with. I saw a few when I had a history of depression. I was, on medication for a while. I had seen a psychiatrist and had a couple of different therapists that I never really felt like I connected with, or I would tell them things and then either like important things and then would see them like a week or two later and they wouldn't remember that I had told them like some pretty big stuff. And it was kind of like, are you listening to me? Like, even if we're not actively taking notes, like maybe after our session. So I kind of felt like this was like a similar situation. Like I would tell her stuff and I didn't really feel like there was a connection there. I didn't really feel like she was understanding where I was coming from or was helpful. And then I feel like actually what really helped was when I did a lot of meditation and hypnobirthing to prepare for my second birth. I felt like that had really helped me to kind of like train my mind to stay calm when I would start to feel a lot of anxiety, or I would have like breathing exercises I would do, or like tools I could use. Like I would focus on like sounds that I was hearing, or, things that I was seeing, or things that I was feeling, like I felt like that helped more than anything else did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those very different, but like, I mean, in the end, rewarding experiences. I'm so happy you had your VBAC.
Yeah. Thank you. I've told my husband if we have more children, I'm having home births. I could have had a really good hospital birth experience with my midwife, but I didn't get the chance to experience that. And my 2 hospital experiences have like ruined that for me. And, other stories I've heard of terrible hospital experiences also. So I'm like, if we have any more children, they will be born at home. I'm not doing it,
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's already been shown that. Yeah. It's another number, which, yeah.
And, my second was almost accidentally born at home. So why not just, stay home and relax?
Just stay home. Yeah.
Yeah. Had her in the shower.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Stay in the water.
Yeah. I'm due with my second at the end of January. And I'm like, I've already talked to my husband, like, what if there's a snowstorm when I go into labor?
Yeah.
Like, we have a friend that's 5 minutes away and she's a labor and delivery nurse. I'm like, that'll be my first call.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something to really consider.
I know.
Yeah.
End of January in Missouri, you don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah, that's very true.
Funny.
I know. I know. And then 2 weeks later, we're going to have like 10 inches of snow. I swear.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
there's a
nuts.
nice storm with Arthur's birth in between, like before I think it was the day we got released.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, can we just stay another
right?
I don't want to drive in this.
Yeah. And you guys weren't close either. Like,
No.
it's a far drive.
30-minute drive.
Yeah.
And a nice storm. That's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really scary. So is there any advice you would give to VBAC moms or new moms who have a history of depression?
For VBAC moms, I would just say, like, if that's something you really want to pursue it's always helpful. I always recommend talk to your medical provider about whether or not you're a good candidate. But advocate for yourself. If you feel like your provider doesn't fully support you, find one who does. Like, I talked to a woman this week who said she fired 4 doctors, before she decided to have a home birth with a midwife. And I was like, I love that phrasing of like, you fired 4 doctors, because it implies that you're in charge, which you are, but a lot of doctors don't let you know that you're in charge. So advocate for yourself. Know, if this is what you want, then, work for it. I'm a huge supporter of VBACs. I feel like not enough women are given the opportunity to VBAC, and, if they want it. And, if you decide that a repeat C-section is the right choice for you, you have options with that too. You should always know your options, I feel like, and make the decision that's best for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as far as like postpartum depression, like if something's not right, if you're not feeling, there's no shame in asking for help. There's no shame in letting somebody know, like, I'm not feeling right. I'm not feeling like myself. Definitely. You want to be the best mother you can be to your baby. A happy mother is a happy, has happy babies and happy children. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I saw something today. It was probably on Instagram or something that said like one of the hardest parts about postpartum depression and anxiety is that like you feel like your symptoms are like yourself. Like that's like your new, I don't even know, personality or something. It's not like you don't recognize them as symptoms, which is hard to.
I've heard like
recognize.
Somebody might not like directly come out and be like, I'm depressed. They might be like, oh, I'm struggling, or I'm, feeling like I'm having a hard time keeping up, or I'm not feeling quite like myself, as opposed to like, hey, I think I'm depressed, or, I have anxiety.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah, sure. So it's a birth story podcast, I guess, with a focus on things that we've learned throughout our labor and delivery experiences. So it's called Labor Lessons, and each episode is a separate lesson. There's a lot of, advocating for yourself. That those are the lessons that, are learned through labor and delivery, but in so many different experiences. I talked to a woman this past week who was a nurse and who had a really serious uterine infection, and nobody would listen to her. And she was like, I was a nurse, and I fell through the cracks. Like, it's so important to have a strong support system to help you advocate for yourself. So I found it's like really helpful to hear, one, that like you're not alone in your experiences. 2, that you can learn from other women's experiences. And like kind of 3, like I also love sharing some of those empowering birth stories, because then it's kind of like, well, how do we have empowering birth stories? Like there are so many traumatic birth stories out there that it's, it's sad. So it's also really great to hear how women have empowering births, which is awesome too. So I've learned a lot from talking to people. I found a lot of similarities from talking to people, even though our stories are different. There's still a lot of similar feelings and thoughts, through your experiences. So yeah, it's been a really great experience so far.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
We're always here to be guests.
All right. Yeah. Anytime.
Yeah.
Carly just had Alyssa Alter on too.
I did, yeah.
Oh my God, that's awesome. I love that.
It's hilarious. She's hilarious.
Hilarious.
Her
I've
story
never
is
laughed
so
harder.
Traumatic. It's so
I know.
traumatic.
But I was laughing too. We love you, Alyssa.
She's awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. And yeah,
this is great. Thanks for having me. It was really great to talk to you too, and get to know you a little bit better also.
Yeah, you too.
And we'll link your podcast for our listeners, and then we'll link your social media.
Cool. All right. Sounds good. Thank you.
Oh. And don't forget to follow us, Liz and Natalie.
Yes.
And rate and review. And we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.